Hello everyone and welcome to this Sussex Ornithological Society webinar. My name is Katie and I'm on the SOS Council and also part of the wildlife team at the RSPB. Just so you are aware, this, as it is said, that this is being recorded. There is no chat function, but do place any questions in the Q&A box. Tonight we are joined by Sara Humphrey, who is a conservation communicator and photographer based in Eastbourne, East Sussex, who first started getting to grips with wildlife photography and video around 6 years ago. Choosing to remain car-free and living in an area with good public transport, Sara now uses her photos and video to help inspire people about the wildlife they can find close to home. So welcome, Sara, and over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I've got a few slides to share with you all, so hopefully you can see that screen coming through now. As Katie said, I'm based in Eastbourne, so live in the centre of Eastbourne town, but bird all over Sussex, mainly by public transport wherever I can or on foot. And that's the premise of the talk for today. So it's low cost and low carbon bird watching, and I'll be giving you some tips and tricks on how you can use and utilise low carbon and low cost bird watching. But first, what is low carbon bird watching? So low carbon bird watching is where you try and reduce your carbon footprint by using methods such as public transport, cycling between destinations, using just your own 2 feet and bird watching in your local patch. And today's talk is aimed at looking at how I've done that through my birding experiences and giving you a little bit of background as to why I choose to do that, why I find it so rewarding, and also how it kind of saves me money and keeps my my costs quite low for bird watching. This talk is aimed at people looking at hobby birding. So some of the advice I give around kind of low cost kit might not be what you want if you're looking for professional photography. So just bear that in mind, because I do use kind of a bridge camera and that is what keeps my costs down, but that isn't the kind of quality camera that you'd be wanting to use if you were aiming to sell your photos at the end of the day. So yeah, very much for hobby birding and for people's enjoyment. So while I'm going to focus on birds today, I don't just photograph birds. I photograph all different types of wildlife. This is an adder that I photographed on the South Downs, as you're probably aware. So what I do when I'm out in nature is I don't just look for birds, I look kind of across the landscape and for every bit of wildlife, every bit of flora and fauna that I can find. And I've had work used on BBC Springwatch, ITV and by various conservation charities as well. So some of you might know that the adders that I filmed a couple of years ago on the South Downs, the fighting adders, were used on Springwatch. But as I say, for today's talk, I'm going to focus primarily on birds because I know we're all keen on getting as much bird watching in as we can. And keeping our costs down whilst we do it. So here's a scene setter for how I started to get into low carbon birding. This is Mount Caburn. It's one of the high hills that overlook kind of the Lewis down to Cookmere area. And I only started bird watching around 5-6 years ago. Was really new to it, but didn't have a lot of nature reserves near me, especially not a lot with hides. So the way I started bird watching was actually quite unusual. I was just kind of getting the train into Brighton for work each day, looking out the window and feeling kind of that I wanted to spend more time in that landscape, and Mount Caburn really kind of called out to me. It was one of those places that I just really wanted to go and explore. And so I started doing that on my commute home after work. So it would be kind of getting off at different stops along the train ride, and just spending my summer evenings kind of exploring that landscape. And I wasn't primarily going for birds. I was going just to be out in nature, going for fitness as well as photography. But Mount Caburn was probably the point where I realised that birds were something special to me. So I'd get up to the top of Mount Caburn, you'd have these glorious sunsets. But then you'd get this meadow pipit or a skylark kind of pop up out of the grass. And I was fascinated by these birds because they're such little brown jobs, as we call them, but you kind of lost sight of them the minute they disappeared into that grassland habitat. And that was where I kind of really spent my time trying to get close to that wildlife with my very basic camera at the time, and really start to kind of see if I could capture that charisma and that character of those species on camera. And through that process, I kind of taught myself a little bit of the early steps of fieldcraft, realizing that actually these are quite flighty birds. They're not the same as photographing birds in your back garden that are coming down to a bird feeder. And I really did have to kind of employ patience and understanding of how that wildlife was behaving to even get a kind of semi-decent ID shot at that stage. So at this point, I was using an FZ7 II camera. So I think it was a Canon, possibly. I'm not an expert on cameras, I must admit. I'm better at my wildlife. But it had a 60 times optical zoom, so it wasn't a bad camera, but it wasn't anything particularly high-end, particularly special. And it did mean I had to work an awful lot harder to get those shots. So Mount Caburn was one of the first areas that I kind of explored wildlife photography. It was definitely low carbon because I was hiking up those hills after work, and not just hiking up to see the birds, but to see the landscape. And it was things like meadow pipit and skylark, and then the kestrels and the buzzards that would be swooping over that landscape that really kind of draw me to them. So originally, as you can see, it was the paragliders and the landscape, but then the birds took over. So this is a skylark. This was taken in a rape field near Polegate. It was not one of those kind of locations that most people would think to go birding in. It was down a very busy main road, just at the foot of the South Downs. But it was one of those fields that I'd looked at from the train window and just gone, actually, I quite want to go see if I can find something in there. I quite want to see if there's some bird life that I can explore. That contrast of getting that on camera could be quite good. And I was amazed at the shots that I did get in the end. I will just say this skylark is in an alarm pose. It was calling to another skylark. I didn't scare this bird into that alarm pose. And one of the things that I became acutely aware of working in conservation while trying to teach myself about birding was just how easy it is to disturb wildlife and how sensitive the habitats are that these birds and these animals live in. So there's a lot of my work is involved in that practice of managing disturbance, of thinking about the ecology, of learning about the species and its behaviour. And that's what helps me kind of get close to them without putting any additional pressure on these animals. This is a buzzard that I took in Berwick. So Berwick, again, was one of those locations that when I was coming through on the train, it just looked so enticing. And I wasn't even aware of Arlington Reservoir at that point. I was so new to the bird watching scene that I didn't know that kind of just a little bit further down the road, there were hides and signs that would tell me what was nearby, and give me all of that information that I was probably really desperately needing at that point. But with my fairly basic camera, I was wandering around the landscape, and obviously buzzards are quite large birds and they are quite easy to photograph if you've got the patience and the quiet to get close to them. So what I'll go through next is a couple of the ways that different types of fieldcraft skills can help you keep your costs low. As I said, using quite a basic camera at this stage. And I use a bridge camera, and I swear by my bridge camera. So this is my current camera, because it means I can get those complete range of shots. So when I'm out in the countryside, I don't go after a single species. I walk around and look and try and find as much variation as I can find in that landscape. And using a bridge camera, which doesn't have the interchangeable lenses, is cheaper, much cheaper, quite a lot of the time, but also it means that I've got that flexibility to suddenly switch between a close-up nightingale and a distant red kite, which was exactly the experience that I had with my first nightingale and red kite at Pulborough. So I was at RSPB Pulborough Brooks that day, and if I'd not had a bridge camera, I would have only been able to capture one of those species on camera. But having that flexibility was really important. And part of the reason that I continue to use a bridge camera, even though I'm kind of pushing towards that end of trying to get my photography out there and published more now, is that it is incredibly lightweight. So when you're looking at low carbon birding, you don't want to be carrying loads of kit around with you all of the time. You really, really want to keep your kit bag as light as possible, particularly if you're doing a lot of your birding on foot. So that bridge camera is one of those really important tools for me in making sure that I can kind of hike quite long distances whilst keeping my my kit manageable. And to be honest, it's very rarely in my bag anyway. It's most of the time it's just around my neck. So as I say, this buzzard was in a kind of a slightly off-piste area of Berwick. It wasn't on the main reserve. It was just those bits that I was exploring around the fringes, and sometimes that can reveal some incredibly beautiful wildlife. So the next photo that I have here is a turtle dove, and this is one of those birds that I found off the beaten track. Now, obviously, turtle dove numbers are massively in decline in Sussex and across the UK. So I haven't popped the location of this species on here just because they are under so much pressure, but turtle doves can be found at Knepp if people do want to see them. And if you want any more information about turtle doves, visit the Operation Turtle Dove website. But this was down a public trail. It wasn't a bird I was expecting to find. It was one I'd really, really, really longed to see. And it was that learning about habitat types and that real understanding of what these species need. And I do work in turtle dove conservation. So I was kind of in a privileged position to understand exactly what they do need. But it was looking at the surrounding habitat and seeing that beautiful, thick, dense scrub, that rich mix of farmland where they could get in and feed, the thick scrub that they could nest in, and plenty of nearby watering holes. And it is one of those species that once you can see the ecology and once you can work out exactly what that species needs, it's so much easier to kind of guide yourself in the right direction. And that's one of the beautiful things about low carbon birding, in my opinion, is that it makes you really focus in on not just what you want to see, but the habitat that each individual species needs as well. That said, there can often be some quite profound surprises. So this is a nightingale, and this was actually taken down the edge of a public footpath between Arlington and Abbotswood, and it's just a tiny little spinney behind the back of somebody's house, and there's this amazing little copse of newly planted trees, and there was just this nightingale singing. And there must be so many species that we don't record or we don't monitor because they're in slightly unlikely places. And this is why low carbon birding is so interesting to me, because if I wasn't having to walk that day between Berwick Station all the way through to Polegate, I probably never would have stumbled across this bird. I mean, there are a number of other nightingales in the area, so it wasn't a first kind of discovery for me. But what it does mean is that when we are reporting that data and when we are highlighting locations of different species, that kind of low carbon birding approach and going off the beaten track and finding species in places that perhaps people aren't looking for them can be so valuable when it comes to conservation monitoring as well. Another site that's incredibly special to me, being based in Eastbourne, is West Rise Marsh. So I'm sure many of you will have heard of West Rise Marsh over the last couple of years. It's become a bit of a more well-known birding spot. It's home to kind of quite a lot of different wetland species in winter. So bearded tits are quite prevalent there in winter. And it's just this tiny little patch, this urban oasis of wetland in the centre of Eastbourne, and it doesn't look much when you skirt around the edges. For those of you who don't know, it's kind of just off the Lotbridge Drove Road, so quite a busy industrial area, and it's home to some amazing species. So I've seen bearded tits there, I've seen marsh harrier, it can be quite good for yellow wagtail, and it's like the first watering hole on migration for a lot of species coming over the channel. So it really does pull in these amazing birds at migration season, and there will be places like that dotted all around the south coast. And I know Matt Eade kind of gave a brilliant talk a couple of weeks ago about some of the underwatched areas of Sussex, and mentioned Hastings and a few places like that. So what I do when I'm looking for migratory birds is I try and pick off the places that are most likely to have the key things that wildlife will need at that time. So it might be water, it might be shelter, it might be feeding opportunities. But if you're looking to start low carbon birding and keep your costs down, one of the ways I'd really recommend to do that is to look at what wildlife needs and what is available near you, because it can help you find some really amazing undiscovered places. Another one that I used to bird in quite a lot, although possibly don't as much anymore, was Alexandra Park in Hastings. Again, really urban park, but there's some really rare kind of habitat at the back of that, where you've got grey wagtails and lots of little woodland birds, some brilliant woodpeckers. You can get kingfishers. I think they've even had bittern there in winter. And it's not a birding location. It's not really on the map as far as we're concerned. But I've found some fantastic wildlife walking around there. I used to work in Hastings, so I used to go walk around there in the evenings. And it can be great for really close-up experiences, because it's such an urban environment, so the wildlife there is a lot more used to people. Going back to West Rise, another one of the surprising species that turned up there recently is some penduline tits that spent the winter at the West Rise marshes. So it really does show that, like, that patch birding and that patch watching approach can throw up some really unexpected surprises. And the gentleman that found this, it was just an incredible achievement, because you wouldn't expect such a rare bird to be in such an urban location. So the next technique that I would say is worth using, if you're trying to keep your carbon footprint down, if you're trying to go through that low carbon and low cost approach to birding, is really study the sounds that birds make. So penduline tits are one of those species that can quite often be picked up on sound rather than sight. They've got quite a distinctive call. And a friend of mine kind of told me about the process of learning birdsong. I'm really bad at learning birdsong. I can't retain the mnemonic devices that people tell you, like the little bit of bread and no cheese for a yellowhammer. I either lock them in or I don't. But that aptitude for being able to ID and lock in birdsong can be so useful in saving you like time and energy when you're looking for wildlife locally, because it's like just having a whole different map and a way of observing wildlife. And it's probably one of the most valuable skills I've learned, is that ability to ID things by sound. And because it does just draw your attention right into that particular place, and can get you closer to wildlife before it sees you, which is a really important feature if you're trying to use kind of lower end technology, particularly like cheaper cameras, cheaper binoculars, because then you can get close-up views without disturbing those species. And it's just such a rewarding experience, particularly at this time of year when everything's returning and you're hearing things for the first time. There's so much joy in the air at the moment, just because I know I can hear what's returning and I can hear them by sound, even if I'm not seeing them. And the more you observe, the more you will see. So my year list last year was over 200. I think I got to 211 in the end. And I'd been trying to get over 200 low carbon birding since the year that COVID first happened. So it's been a difficult achievement. I definitely set myself that target in the wrong year. But there are some tips and tricks to finding species in particular habitats at particular times of year, particularly if you're low carbon birding, that will come in useful. So things like this pied flycatcher quite often end up using roughly the same locations, particularly on outbound migration, that they'd use on inbound. So it's worth kind of making either written notes or mental maps of where you've seen things in the past and the dates that you've seen them, so that you can go back and look for them again. That will really help you to kind of create this amazing kind of diary, I suppose, of your local landscape and what you might be hoping to see, particularly if your aim is to get photographs, like mine often is. Because it means that you can get a lot closer to those species. You're not spending lots of time walking across different destinations just on the off chance that you might see something. You can give yourself a very educated guess as to where something might be. Another one that's quite often in the same place is a black redstart. So Seaford Head is one of the most reliable places to find them on my stretch of coast, but I often find them at Cookmere as well. They'll use the pillbox cement structures, and they seem to quite like that habitat. So often when I'm down at Cookmere in the autumn period or the winter period, I'll have a quick scan around there, and often I will be rewarded with a black redstart. Another place that's really good for them is Beltoot, actually, and that structure around there. One of my favourite birds to look for, which is tricky low carbon, and I do have to concede occasionally and use taxis, is the ring ouzel. So these birds will be at the top of the downs quite often around the Beachy Head area in the autumn period, and they are so difficult to find unless you can find them by sound and you've got that mental map of where they've been in the past. Low carbon birding is a lifestyle that I choose to pursue, but there are times when I have to take safety into account as well. And the reason I'll get taxis up to Beachy Head is because if I'm going out at the crack of dawn, it's just not safe or practical for me to be walking up the downs in the dark alone at 5, 6 in the morning to get up there for sunrise, which is the best time to see these species. So while I'm talking about low carbon birding, do consider your personal safety and what's comfortable for you as well. There is no one size fits all to low carbon birding. It's just about making the right choices for you and the right choices for the environment. And there will be some really unexpected species that you can find in really local locations. So this is a juvenile Tethys warbler. Again, going back to that urban location, it was really showy, it was really comfortable around people because it's bred in such an urban park. And it's one of those species that I'd never really, they're really quite tricky to photograph. People can spend quite a lot of time in hides, quite a lot of energy going to see these birds. But they can be found in really surprising areas, and there'll be places across Eastbourne where you can hear them singing in drainage ditches. They're becoming really quite prevalent in the local area. Shinewater Lakes is just off the other side of the road to West Rise Marshes, so it's all joined up habitat. So if you're looking for good patches near you, what I would do is open up a map, find somewhere that's got some good water, whether it's fresh water, whether it's coast, and look for that habitat corridor, because that's what wildlife seems to really like. It likes that joined up habitat that it can move through, which is why it's so important that we create it through conservation as well. If you're just getting started on birding, and I did this totally the wrong way around, but I would use hides and blinds to help yourself learn what species look and act like when they're relaxed, because it makes getting closer to wildlife out in the field so much easier. So if you're looking to start low carbon birding and really get the best out of it, then you really need to invest some time in learning about those species, what their body language looks like, what their disturbance signals sound like, because then you can see the early signs of that behaviour. And each animal will have its own comfort zone. But this habitat was taken at Rye Harbour. I was sat in one of the hides. I could watch it really clearly. I could see it moving around. And actually that meant later in the year when I went back to photograph the habitats with their young and they were out in a far more open bit of habitat, I could read those signals and I could get quite close to those species, knowing full well that I wasn't causing any disturbance because they weren't displaying any sort of discomfort behaviour. And it does mean, again, that you can get a lot closer with the kit that you've got. I wouldn't necessarily suggest mobiles by themselves, but you can get adapters that you can clip onto scopes, which can help it work as a camera, but mean that you're not kind of having to spend additional money on a camera and your scope. You can double up and save yourself some money that way too. And when this comes in particularly useful is when you're working with shorebirds. So there's some real tips and tricks for working with shorebirds with photography. I would plan my day as much as possible when I was going out on a low carbon walk, because Rye Harbour, for example, it's about a 15-mile circuit for me. If I'm walking from the station right the way around the perimeter of the reserve, I expect it to be a dawn till dusk day. I mean, it is a heavenly dawn till dusk day, but it is long. So what I tend to do is time the tides. So I'll do a lot of preparation in advance, time my trip so that I'm roughly on the high tide or the low tide, depending on what I want from photography. And if I'm aiming for photos like this, where you've got this gorgeous young ringed plover sat in front of you, I didn't approach this bird. What I did was I settled into, in fact, I was sunbathing on the beach, to be perfectly frank. I'd settled into that location about an hour before high tide was due to come up. And then what you'll get is the shorebirds kind of coming up to you and walking closer to you as they're foraging along the coastline. And they will relax because you also relax, particularly if you're keeping a low profile. So there are ways that you can really encourage wildlife to come close to you without playing things like alarm calls, and without kind of feeding or putting out preferred habitat bits for them. I prefer to focus my wildlife energy on capturing birds in their natural behaviour and their natural setting. And I think there's something particularly rewarding about shots like this when you can see that that bird is engaged with you, but it's sat comfortably, it's perfectly calm. And one of my favourite ever photos is of a purple sandpiper doing just that. Now, it's really, really rare that I see these purple sandpipers just sat on the shore. I've seen it twice, but when they do, and when they're at that high tide roost on the shore at tide mills rather than on the arm, it does create quite a captivating image. And that bird's aware of me, it's conscious of me. There was somebody else behind me at the time, but it isn't alarmed, and it just looks so relaxed. And I wasn't that far away from that bird at the time, but it was because I was just sat there waiting for it to come down. So really learning that bird behaviour can be such an advantage when you're wanting to keep your costs low. And it also means that if you're spending a lot of time kind of thinking about where you're headed, you're not spending lots and lots of time walking around looking for things. Once you learn your patch, you can kind of wait for things to come to you a lot more. Birding is a lot to learn, so don't be afraid to ask for help, talk to others online or in person. And the community that we have with Sussex Ornithological Society and the network of birders in Sussex is so fantastic. I wish I'd known about resources like SOS from the start. I made it so much harder for myself by not checking things like regular sightings pages or learning migration patterns or talking to local birders. So do build that community for yourself as well, because it is one of the easiest ways to save yourself time and energy when low carbon birding. You don't have to spend lots of time kind of finding things for yourself. There are people out there that will be happy to help you as long as it's not putting additional pressure on the wildlife. And be prepared for surprises and plans to go completely out the window as well. So this was a day that I spent at Rye last year. I had lots of plans to go down to the beach for high tide and photograph things like that ringed plover that I talked about earlier. But actually, I got to a hide and suddenly spotted this bird out the corner of my eye that felt a little bit odd. And as I say, I'm quite a new birder. I know my limits, and this definitely was my limit. I knew there was something different about this species, but I didn't know just how rare it was when I started putting messages out on social media going, can anyone help me ID this? So this is a summer plumage, I believe, white-winged black tern. It came in for around 5 hours. It wasn't there very long at all, but it was consistently foraging for flies and insects just off the top of the water, around like a figure of 8 loop just in front of the hide. And it was such an amazing experience. And I had gone to Rye specifically that day because it was the right time of year to get unusual species, but I definitely hadn't expected anything quite this unusual. So yeah, I then spent the rest of the day in that hide until that bird disappeared. So do be prepared for plans to go out the window. On the other hand, if you're low carbon birding and you have decided to commit to it as a lifestyle choice, which I have, I don't actually have a car. I can drive, but I choose not to own a car because I know that it would probably make me quite lazy. But there will be times where birds like this Lapland bunting linger and you can get to see them and you can get to photograph them. But there will be other times where having those rare alerts set up on your phone will just be the most frustrating thing in the world. And there's been a couple of times where that's happened to me and I've had to make a real judgment call over whether it's worth kind of spending 2 hours hiking across the South Downs on the off chance of something quite rare and unusual sticking around, or just cutting my losses and going, do you know what, I'm not going to be in with a good chance of seeing that bird. And unfortunately, the melodious warbler that turned up a couple of years back was one of those birds. I had a feeling it just wasn't going to hang around. It didn't feel like it was going to be a long staying bird, and I decided not to go for it. And I'm really glad I decided not to go for it because it wasn't long staying and it had gone very shortly after I heard about it, and I just wouldn't have had the physical time to get there. On the other hand, there are some birds that will draw in people from all around. And one of the biggest high carbon ways to watch wildlife is to solo twitch. So if you're interested in going for megas and rares, I'd really encourage you to consider carpooling, or to look at whether you can get there by public transport. And the reason I say that is because this American robin was local to me. Like, it was virtually on my doorstep. I could walk from my house to it. But it was really, really accessible by public transport as well. And I spent a fair bit of time at this event talking to other bird watchers, seeing some amazing friends that I hadn't seen for a really long time from all over the country. It was such an unusual bird to turn up that it really did draw the crowds from all over. But one person I spoke to drove over 500 miles down from Scotland and 500 miles back solo just to see this bird. Now, putting that into perspective, the annual average car mileage in the UK is 7,600 miles, according to the Department for Transport. So that's a significant amount of what you would expect to be driving in a year just for one bird. I'm not saying don't go for rares. We all want to see rares, but consider whether or not you could carpool, consider whether or not you could use public transport. This particular bird was a really, really easy train drive. So wasn't particularly far out of Eastbourne. You could walk it from the station, or there was a bus that went to the end of the road if you needed to consider access needs. So there was a really low carbon way to go and see this species, but a lot of people chose not to, despite the fact that we tried to kind of make sure there was as much information about the low carbon angle as possible when people were putting out information about this species. So I really do think it's worth considering whether you could adapt your behaviour just to look at whether or not there are more carbon effective ways to look at bird watching. And sometimes that might mean making a day of it. So the hooded crow would be a good example of that. There was a hooded crow at Polegate McDonald's for quite a long time. And I know a lot of people kind of went to see that, but also went and saw a couple of other things at the same time. I think it was possibly the Humes warbler that was on Eastbourne Seafront that people were going to see at the same time. So combining those journeys so that you were getting the most out of them. But also, if you're visiting a different area, why not tick off something else that you want to see off your list? So with the hooded crow example, I then wandered a little way down the track to Abbots Wood, which was quite nearby, only to discover my first hornfinches in the hornbeam at the back end of the woodland. So a really underwatched area of the woodland that I happened to know about because the only way that I could get from Polegate Station to Abbots Wood was through this trail. And it was the first time they'd been recorded there that year, and they were the first hawfinch I'd ever seen. So it really was a special moment. And here's a really poor photo of a hawfinch because they weren't particularly easy to photograph. One of the barriers of low carbon birding is that there are often birds that you have to consider as being on your outer limits of birding. Hawfinches are one of these. I know there's a couple of populations in Sussex, but they're often in really inaccessible places. And another couple of those birds are hen harrier and nightjar. For me, they're quite difficult to see, particularly difficult to see safely for nightjar or hen harrier, because they tend to come in, well, they tend to be most present early in the evening. And while I can walk there safely or get there safely low carbon, I can't always get back. So yeah, definitely don't compromise safety when it comes to thinking about low carbon birding. But there will be surprises, and you will find things on your local patch that you really weren't expecting. So this was actually my birthday last year, and for my birthday I decided that I wanted to go for dinner with my family and then go for a wander around the marshes because I wanted to be out in nature, and found this redstart, which I'd not ever seen at West Rise before. It felt like a really unlikely location. And you will get some things that just turn up in unlikely places. So Dartford warbler is another one. You wouldn't expect to see Dartford warbler in a wetland, but there have been a couple sighted at West Rise. So you will find things in unexpected locations, and it is worth just having a look around, particularly if you're going after a long journey, and factor in disappointment. So I was probably one of the last people in Sussex to see this redback shrike, and the reason I didn't travel to Medmerry to see it earlier was because I'd already tried to see a shrike twice in my life. It was a bird I desperately wanted to see. I'd heard about it as a child through the Animals of Farthingwood, but sometimes low carbon birding will give you more disappointments than successes. I travelled over 18 miles, I think, in a day to try and see a great grey shrike and catch mergansers on the same day, and the day was an entire bust. So I think I made the decision then that I wasn't going to majorly travel, even by public transport, for rares anymore. But for this shrike, I did. I had a day off. I got a train, a bus, and then hiked. Just to see this redback shrike, but then I got that and was lucky enough to see the buff-breasted sandpiper. But the reason that I did that is because I knew that the journey to Medmerry in itself was worth it. I was going to see something good that day, even if the redback shrike wasn't still around. I don't just low carbon bird in Sussex. I do this all over the UK. So last year I spent some time in Portland Bill. I visited RSPB Lodmore. I was down in Portleven looking for chough. I was in Penzance briefly, the North Norfolk coast, and Bute in Scotland. And I've just come back from Dorset today. And I will try and find birds and wildlife wherever I go. And with a little bit of preparation, you can. So once you've learned all of the skills that I've talked about already around fieldcraft, you'll find that it's so much easier to find things even in new locations when you're low carbon birding. Preparation goes a long way, but it doesn't always pay off, as I said, and I would definitely say that Google Maps is not set up for walking. So if you're interested in getting into low carbon birding, I'd really recommend downloading or buying OS maps, because one of the most hair-raising walking experiences I've had was going to see these stone curlew in Suffolk, and I had to walk down a really busy road, very fast 60-mile-an-hour road, and there were dead deer either side of the road, and it was just the most uncomfortable experience because I felt so unsafe walking down that road with no public footpath. And in the end I had to get a taxi back because it just didn't feel particularly safe or practical. So yeah, don't rely on Google Maps when it comes to birding or walking around anywhere, because it's not set up for foot traffic. But yeah, look at getting an OS map app or buying OS maps for the area you're visiting, and don't just look in the immediate vicinity either. So while I had, as you saw, very cloudy visuals of a stone curlew, I promise that is a stone curlew. Not that anyone could really ID it from that shot, but I did then find some incredible woodlark nearby. So yeah, definitely worth walking around the wider area, not just focusing on your chosen species if you're visiting new patches. And then there's a couple of other trips where I've kind of gone with a target species in mind. And again, as I said earlier, using that fieldcraft skill, using that local knowledge, doing a bit of preparation can mean that you can find some amazing birds just on foot or by public transport. So this is a twite, and I was desperate to see them when I spent time up in Scotland. I got a bus, I think, for this one. Yeah, got a bus down really early to one of the shorelines in the morning, and then I think I spent about 4 or 5 hours walking around until the next bus came back round, but was rewarded with incredible views of twite. Then the following day I climbed a mountain in the dark to look for eagles, massively dipped on the eagles, but was rewarded with my first ever crossbills. So there are ways that you can do things if you're willing to spend the time and the effort on that low carbon approach. And even this morning, I managed to find a Dartford warbler in a completely new area to me. So it shows just how easy it can be to find unusual species in unusual locations once you've got those tips nailed. If you want to know more about my work, and I do share quite a lot of tips and tricks on both low carbon birding and fieldcraft skills. My Instagram, Twitter and Facebook handles are Sussex Sara, and I'm not an expert on low carbon birding. I do what works for me, but if you want to find out more about it and learn about other people's experiences as well, I really recommend visiting lowcarbonbirding.net or following Birding Climate on Twitter, because this is a growing movement. There are a lot more people doing it, and it's a really good way to find out how people experience it, what the barriers are, what the challenges are, but what the rewards are. And in my eyes, low carbon is an investment that's well worth the reward, not just for us, but for the planet and the wildlife we love too.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. Yeah, definitely jealous of some of your sightings for sure. So we do have some questions which have come in. So I hope everyone has enjoyed that. What's a species you haven't seen but is, say, top of your bucket list?
Ooh, there's not many I haven't seen that are kind of local to us. I think Capercaillie is definitely quite high on my list, but not that local and not that accessible. I think, yeah, anything in the Caledonian Forest is probably quite high on my list, but would require a lot of planning to do low carbon.
What's been the most, obviously, yeah, you mentioned the white-winged tern, but what else has been the most surprising or kind of exciting animal behaviour that you've witnessed?
Oh, okay. So the most exciting and unusual was a goosander trying to predate a dunlin.
Wow.
And it was so unusual that I actually had a chat with the guy that runs Wader Tales, and looked into whether or not that had ever been recorded before. And we went back to like the 1800s, and there were records of it being like them having predated birds, as in them being in their digestive tract, but it had never been actually caught on camera before. And again, it comes back to that hearing, because the only way I caught that on camera was that I actually heard the dunlin scream. The dunlin did get away, but it was a perfectly healthy dunlin. I'd seen them come down. So it really was unusual behaviour. This goosander had like swum down the channel at Cookmere Haven, past the birds, and then turned around and grabbed one. Very strange behaviour.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I've not heard of that before. That's crazy.
I wouldn't have believed it had I not caught it.
Yeah, I can imagine like someone describing that, you'd think, no, that's surely not.
No.
Have you ever done any bird ringing? And if so, any tips for young people looking to get into it at all?
I've never done any bird ringing, mainly because my nearest ringing station is in quite a secluded place, and not driving would make it quite an uncomfortable experience, I think. But also, like, that time of year is the time that I want to be out doing migration photography. But there are so many brilliant bird ringers in Sussex. So yeah, if you haven't spoken to anybody at SOS yet, I'd give them a tweet later, and see if anybody there can give you some advice, because yeah, Sussex Ornithological Society are great at supporting things like that.
Perfect, thank you. Is there a part of the UK you haven't been to yet but are keen to explore this year?
Yeah, there's a fair few bit. I mean, I haven't been everywhere I'd like to yet. I'm definitely very keen on UK bird watching. That's my area. There's definitely parts of Scotland that I'd like to explore more. I've only done a very small part of Wales. But actually in England, I'd really like to spend a little bit more time kind of on the west coast, but the north of England. That's kind of the area. Midlands and the north is probably the bit that I know the least at the moment. So yeah, I'd be curious to see what hangs out around there. Anything with dippers is always good in my book as well, because we don't get those in Sussex.
Yeah, nice. You're obviously, yeah, you've had some incredible sightings. Do you record them in terms of like do you submit recordings to like the BTO or yeah, county bird recorders, etc.?
I'm not as good at it as I should be, and I do need to get better, because that data is so valuable. If it's something particularly important when it comes to breeding, then yes. So things like nightingales, turtle doves, I try and make sure I'm recording. Or if it's something that could be subject to development, then that recording is so much more important in helping kind of create a case for that area not being developed. But yeah, it's definitely something I need to do better at.
Cool. And finally, what's your go-to place? What's your top spot? Anywhere that you have real fond memories of? I
think for sheer biodiversity on any given photography day, it's probably Rye Harbour, because I know I can see kind of a good 40 species and get decent photographs of them in a day, which is quite unusual, particularly for somewhere that I can get to so easily. I mean, you can get that on a lot of other nature reserves, but not somewhere that's so publicly accessible by public transport. But I'm definitely it varies on the season. There will be times of the year where I'm drawn to the South Downs, or drawn to Rye, or drawn to Arlington Reservoir, and I do kind of let that season guide me quite a lot of the time.
Oh, well, they're all the questions. So thank you so much, Sarah, and I hope everyone enjoyed that. And yeah, as I say, this session has been recorded, so will be available on YouTube as well. But yeah, thank you so much and have a lovely evening, everyone. And thank you for joining.